It has been one of the British government's more controversial policies, Prevent, a programme initially established to deal with radicalisation within the Muslim community. Now, a report by an advocacy group has accused the government of removing children from allegedly radicalised parents. They say it's breaking the law, but is it actually protecting the children? Now, those who pulled this report together work for CAGE itself, a controversial group which advocates for what it calls due process. And CAGE has documented 18 cases involving children in those circumstances. One of the mothers has spoken to Roundtable, her identity hidden to protect the children.
London, 2005. A series of bomb attacks hit the city, killing 52 people and injuring 700. It became the catalyst for Britain's counter-extremism law, Prevent. Initially focused on British Muslim communities and later expanded to include far-right extremism. It's a controversial policy, and now the UK-based advocacy group CAGE is alleging that authorities are using Prevent to take children away from their families.
He looked petrified. He saw me, he came running towards me, and he sat on my lap.
Yusra's case was covered in CAGE's report. She describes the moment when she walked in on her 5-year-old son being questioned at school by plain-clothed police officers. She says he was interrogated about his views because the officers said that they had concerns about his safety.
In my case, the safeguarding concerns that they had was of radicalisation.
Some of her other children had already been questioned.
They asked what kind of friends they have they heard of a country called Syria?
Eventually, Yusra found herself battling in the UK courts to keep her family together. A fight she eventually won.
The judge had said to the local authorities time and time again, what is the prosecuting case you have against the mother? What is your case against the mother? She's an ISIS supporter. Prove it. We, during the raid, found inflammatory materials on her laptop that the children could have possibly viewed it. Prove it. There was no proof. Nothing was substantiated. It was an evidence-based. It was allegation after allegation. These allegations destroyed my life.
She says that the entire ordeal has left her feeling concerned for her children's future. But what if there is a risk of radicalisation to children? Should the state intervene? Under the government's controversial counter-radicalisation prevent duty, institutions must take steps to stop children being drawn into terrorism and spot the warning signs. The report's authors say terrorism is just like any other crime and should not be treated differently.
If someone is convicted of a crime, is it necessary to follow that their children will also commit that crime? Do we do that for bank robbers? Do we do that for murderers? It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't follow. Okay, what we're doing is exceptionalizing this one particular crime because it's politicized. And from our point of view, we want to go back to a simple thing, which is the rule of law and due process.
We contacted the UK Home Office, who insisted proper procedures are being followed.
The UK government and local authorities have always had a duty to safeguard children from those that pose a risk to them. This duty has always been exercised to protect them from mistreatment. Authorities take their responsibilities extremely seriously and carry them out irrespective of the religion or ethnicity of the families involved.
The CAGE report documents 18 cases. But earlier this year, the former national lead for counter-terrorism policing, Mark Rowley, said that 100 children had been safeguarded through the family courts. Is this just another battle between pro and anti-prevent lobbies? Or are the authorities right to fear for children they suspect of being radicalised?
Right, let's get the conversation started via Skype from Leeds. I'm joined by Madeline-Abbas, a lecturer in sociology at the University of Manchester, did a study which she called The Terrors of Counter Terrorism. In the studio, I have Asim Qureshi, Research Director at CAGE, that organisation that you saw in the report which advocates what it calls due process. David Otto with me too, the Director of Global Risk International, helping the government deal with its prevent policy, and Mohammed, Akunjee, criminal defence solicitor working in the field of terrorism. Thank you all very much indeed. Asim Qureshi, let me ask you first of all, Yusra, the woman we saw in that report, was pictured on your website, as was another woman, Sister Mariam, unidentified. Now, she did not have her children taken away from her, and yet she cries out in the clip you've put up on the website, they're taking our babies away, what for? Because we're Muslims, that's all. It's unrepresentative to have her there, isn't it?
No, I mean, this is her experience with the whole process of being safeguarded through the courts, right? Well, they call it safeguarding. So she actually went through the entire process, and in the end, they found that actually there was no risk.
Sister Mariam?
Yes, Sister Mariam.
Sister Mariam claimed that people from Prevent invaded her birthing room.
That's correct.
No, the police say that it was a counter-terrorism officer, that there was nobody there from Prevent, and that counter-terrorism officers asked for permission.
Right. So the thing is, if you want to be pedantic about who is within counter-terrorism, we have to understand is that counter-terrorism police raided the birthing suite, and after that, immediately,
well, they say they asked doctors for an
Oh.
appropriate time to make a brief search because they were looking for a man they believed to be dangerous.
And they knew already by that stage that he wasn't there. So what we're saying is that the whole incident of invading a birthing suite just after somebody has given birth, in order to safeguard a newly born child, okay, is completely ridiculous, okay, for a start, before anything even happens. Then after that, for a Prevent officer to be present at every single meeting where there is a social worker present, okay, takes this into a realm that we think is completely inappropriate. What you do is you securitize an issue. You might say that we need to safeguard because there's accusations of sexual violence or domestic abuse or whatever else. But Prevent is in the space of ideas. So why are we conflating safeguarding around ideas?
I'm putting this out there because
harm?
you have used a video clip from a woman who did not have her children taken away.
But they tried
the authorities say there was nobody there from
But they
Prevent.
tried to take her children away. I don't understand why you're
And you've been ordered,
this issue.
asked by counter-terrorism police to take this video down off your website a year ago and haven't done so.
Well, no, they only asked us recently, and the reason we didn't do so is because the story is true, because we stand by her story, and why would we take something down? They asked us to take it down because they said it gives Prevent a bad name. No, your actions give Prevent a bad name. Prevent in its inception, in its theory, in its practice, okay, is unconscionable, and therefore Mariam's case stands as a representative of many other cases where Prevent in its very idea is wrong-minded.
Do you think this is misleading, what they're doing here?
Well, I think, generally, there is also there's always an issue when it comes to the vulnerability factors that government organizations put in place that gives them the ability to make certain judgments. Now, the problem with the case that he's talking about of the lady is that maybe there was some kind of a misunderstanding, but also the government jumping the gun. What we normally see in majority situations when it comes to children being taken away is when there is clear evidence that the parents' involvement in radicalization or terrorism, gives enough reason for you to believe that that child also is at risk. But I don't see that this particular case, the child was so much at risk that the child was going to be taken away. But again, this is a very controversial. Prevent is a very controversial subject because most of the time the people that apply and implement some of these policies don't have the necessary knowledge. So these are some of the cases where...
I'm just trying to get to the idea of where you stand on this. So let me ask you about something. In that report, a representative of CAGE, and you can come back on this if you like, said children and Muslim children in particular are being politicized. CAGE itself has been described as a political organisation by a House of Commons cross-party committee. That was 2015-2016. So both sides are playing games here, perhaps.
Well, I mean, I think if we focus back on the children being taken away and ultimately being taken away or going through a process of the question being raised as to whether their parents will even have custody of them, I think we're forgetting that there's a process involved as well. It's not just the ultimate final decision by a court that's important. It's the fact that in that process, in that journey where Prevent and Counter-terrorism make an allegation, those children are taken into care often straight away. Right, so those children are separated from their parents, and then a number of weeks long process goes on where those kids don't have access to their parents in many cases. Sometimes they do in a very short sort of basis and supervised basis, and that process itself is highly traumatic. And so looking at something where you're looking at the final outcome, that's one way to look at things. And yes, the numbers actually, thank God, are quite low, where judges take a very sensible approach on a fact-based on a factual basis to establish whether or not what the Home Office will be saying is true or factually proved. And often we find that there's a big disparity between the accusations at the very incept, leading to weeks of separation from children and parents, and the final outcome, which is often where... I
suppose what I'm trying to get at here, Madeline, we're not ignoring, we will come to you in just a second, is that
That's fine.
you say Prevent and the UK authorities are politicising this issue. The suggestion also is that Cage is doing the same thing.
Well, no. I mean, you know, you wouldn't accuse Amnesty International, Liberty, or any other NGO for highlighting what they see as systemic abuses within the system that contradict the rule of law, due process, or human rights, right? And that's exactly what we've always done. We've said that there is a problem with the system itself and the way that it's constructed. Look, forget about Prevent. The criminal justice system itself, we already know has a problem with structural racism, right? That's our starting point. Then on top of that, you put counter-terrorism legislation and policy, which has inchoate offences, it has preparatory offences, it has all of these pre-criminal offences that have nothing to do with violence. The vast majority of terrorism convictions have nothing to do with violence. It's all about kind of strict liability offences and other types of offences where there's not even a suggestion of violence. And then on top of that, you put another program called Prevent, which says, well, we operate in the pre-criminal space. I mean, we're talking about Philip K. Dick here, you know, who wrote about pre-crime as a dystopian kind of like, you know, terrible future, right? And this is the situation that we're in right now, that forget about dealing with the endemic issues that we have already within our criminal justice system. We've gotten to a stage now where we think that we're able to predict future violence or future harm, when actually in any situation that you take in the world, whether it was apartheid, Northern Ireland, the Black Civil Rights Movement, where you had similar types of policies being made that tried to criminalize future violence or future harm, it all resulted in,
I suppose the difficulty
serious
is,
abuses.
whether you dislike the structure of it or not, the difficulty is in letting crimes take place when you believe that perhaps you could stop them and stop children becoming radicalized if you intervene early enough.
What if your program does the very thing that you're trying to stop and sends a message to an entire generation that you are other, you are not part of this society, that you will always be seen as potentially problematic? Like for a whole generation of children who were, say, below the age of, I don't know, 12, when 9/11 happened, the only world they've ever known is where politicians talk about them as being problematic, potentially problematic in the future, where the media has a narrative about them being problematic, where the police force constantly pick them up and stop them, and you know, they see all of this narrative about them being problems.
Well,
Do you think that would be problematic?
Let's ask Madeline about this. The terrors of counter-terrorism, the subheading for the study that you did. Do you recognise in what Asim is saying, what Asim Qureshi is saying here, some of the things that you discovered, that children are thinking, well, hang on, you know, what's the point in not being radicalised if I'm being accused of it beforehand? I'm not part of society as a whole, etc., etc.
It's not that. It's more the sense that it limits young Muslims' ability to be able to engage in activities that their peers are allowed to engage in without the risk of being seen as suspect. So a lot of my participants talked about wanting to attend legitimate organisations and you know, legitimate events, Islamic societies, for example, or stop the war meetings or protests, and feeling like they would be targeted by the state. So it limits that ability for young Muslims to be able to engage in society in legitimate ways, feeling like they're not able to say things, they're not able to talk about politics or foreign policy or to have a comment about religion without the fear of being labelled as extremist. And that is counterproductive, actually, for challenging radicalisation.
Let's bring David Otto back on this, because in one of your comments to our producer before the programme, you sort of said, well, what's the alternative?
It's very important that, yes, you know, when you want to destroy one thing, you've got to be able to bring an alternative. Now, the point that, you know, we have to be able to make is that this is a social science. So some of these factors that these young people show or families show, they have to be looked at from a contextual point of view. So that for me, the best way that the government has to go forward with this is not to label a certain community, but to look at each and every case, you know, on its own merit.
Well, let me ask you this. The vast majority of referrals, as I understand it, certainly more than half of the referrals come from within the communities themselves.
Yeah.
And the danger is that this fractures families. Not only does it take children away, perhaps, from their parents, whatever that is in terms of right or wrong, radicalisation or not radicalisation, it fractures families, it fractures communities.
Of course it does. And what you don't want to do is to create a community that becomes resistant to giving information to the state when they find that, okay, there is an opportunity here to talk to the state. Now, the government doesn't trust the Muslim community and it still relies on the same community to provide information. That is also a huge problem. But, I mean, the reason why the Muslim community doesn't actually trust the government is because they see themselves as being picked upon. But the problem is that you have this...
And are you telling this to the government? Are you telling this?
Of course, when you talk to members of the government about the issues of prevent, you find out that, you know, in most of the cases you have you can't blame the baker when the butcher bakes the bread, because the people who are put in place to actually deal with these issues, you know, do not.
You're saying it's a total mess. It's got the wrong ingredients and the wrong cook.
I think it does have the wrong cooks. You know, the ingredients may be right. The ingredients are available. You have people who have the
intention may be right, that you want something nice on your table, but you're ending up with something that you wouldn't give to the dog.
Of course, because, you know, prevent again is a new strategy in terms of, you know, its outcome.
6-7 years old.
The huge problem that the government has is actually getting people that can actually implement these programs in a way that will not...
So let me put this question to you. We're talking about, I think, maybe 50 children that have been separated from their families. I don't know how many families that involves, but 50 cases as put forward by the authorities. What is another way of doing this? Because if the courts think those children are in any kind of danger, the courts have a duty to act. So what else do you do?
Well, I mean, the issue is we operated with a child safeguarding platform long before Prevent came along, really. And in terms of the number of children who are radicalised, we haven't actually seen any evidence of children doing anything criminal.
That's because this is preemptive.
Well, actually, even before any of this came about. So the question is, what's the mischief that this legislation is actually trying to stop? So often the case is that the matter of like the 3 girls who went off, ran away and joined ISIS, they're often raised as the type of mischief this Prevent mechanism is meant to stop, but it simply wouldn't, because they weren't. Prevent was applied to those girls, didn't see them at all, and they managed to leave.
But I'm asking you more about younger children.
Sure.
Because they were sort of pubescent children. They were sort of 13, 14, 15, 16, I think. What about younger children who have no ability to defend themselves if they are in the wrong environment? Are you saying that the structures we had in place beforehand were good enough, or given the circumstances of the world post 9/11, was something like this necessary?
So I'm not aware of any case where a child operated outside of the family context a prepubescent child who did anything at all terroristic in nature. I'm not aware of a single case.
But I also think that one of the issues which you're talking about here is about if you find that a young child lives in a home with a parent, that is, you know, maybe you suspect that parent is going through a process of radicalization. I mean, where the government is looking at is saying, if a young child lives in a home with a parent who has some kind of a religious extremist views, then ultimately that child also may be passed on that extremist views.
Sure.
Now, but but you know, the question is, where do you take that child to? Where do you put that child? You know, to.
Well, Well, the issue is that these are views, and if we, I mean, presumably the children go to school. Presumably those views then are understood by a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. A professional teacher who's got a degree at school would identify those views and be able to challenge them successfully.
But again we're talking about the far end of cases, those deemed by the courts to be the most extreme. Madeline, and then Asim, I'll ask you this one. If it wasn't for Prevent, how would you deal with this? Did you get any suggestions when talking to people for your study?
The issue with Prevent is that it takes a very top-down approach. And actually, there's some excellent work that is going on within communities by people who really understand their communities and they understand local need. So I would really say that some of the great work that I saw going on in Bradford, for example, were organisations that were locally defined, and that were bridging between the community and policy, but defining solutions locally and based on local needs, and connected to that as well, facilitating safe spaces that were Muslim-led, where these difficult conversations could happen without fear of being reported, and that is really the work that needs to be supported and is happening.
Yeah, Asim, your thoughts on what could be used in the place of this particular type of area of concern?
We're already doing that. You see, the thing is that we just don't call it Prevent. But if you go to any mosque in the UK, like we've done for centuries, our elders give guidance to younger people about what they are supposed to and not supposed to do. The problem is the climate of fear that exists that stops imams, especially, from being able to talk about the very issues that young people want to know about. So the mosque committee or the imams will say, well, we can't talk about Palestine, we can't talk about this, we can't do a conference that helps to teach our kids about the rights and wrongs of jihad, for example, because if we do, the government's going to see us as being problematic. But this is a part of the problem, that we're not doing the very things that we actually could be doing in order to help give the guidance that we need. And this is something that's interesting. When I meet with Prevent practitioners, and I say to them, I put you in a room with a group of 50 young people who maybe have some sympathy for ISIS or don't know either way about this thing. I put you in the room with these 50 kids, and I get Mazen Beg, the former Guantanamo Bay detainee, who's been to Syria, who was calling out ISIS before they even were known as ISIS, and I put him in a room with these kids. I said, I guarantee you there's only one person who's going to come out of there having convinced those kids about the wrongs of that organization. It's never going to be the Prevent practitioner.
I wasn't going to mention,
it's always going to be him.
I wasn't going to bring this up, actually, but I mean, you mentioned jihad just now. You've said you support jihad, particularly in Israel or Chechnya or something like that. If these children are not satisfied with what they're doing, because you've called this state oppression, would you encourage them to perform jihad in this country?
I mean, I don't know why you would ask that question. It seems a bit silly because...
Well, you mentioned jihad, you've talked about the struggle, you've talked about oppression.
Right, so that doesn't necessitate that it means that you do violence everywhere. What we teach our young people is that every single context has its own dynamics, right? And I think it's been very clear that, people like myself, people like Mazen Beg, others who are part of our communities have given very clear guidance that actually we are part of this society, we're part of this culture. I was born and raised here. So when you ask questions like that, it's a weird way of kind of like exceptionalizing me. I think that's quite problematic, and maybe you should think a little bit about yourself when you ask questions like that. But the point is...
It's your answer I'm interested in, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that you've taken one thing, but actually, had you read my literature, had you read the stuff that I've written about all of these topics, you're very clear about the fact that I don't think that's right. That I don't think it's the right. I don't think my religion allows for it.
And you could have said that in 15 seconds rather than give me a
but hold on,
2 minutes.
No. You deserve the lecture though, because inherent in what you ask is this typical kind of blindness to your own bigotry.
But I think in coming
No, I'm simply asking a question. I wanted to get the answer.
The question is as important as the answer.
Yeah, but I think coming to that point, I think it's important for us to also bear in mind that taking down Prevent itself, it's not the solution. But what we keep saying about Prevent is how it has been implemented as some kind of a scientific tool,
right,
which is not. And the key to that is that, we need to get people that can work within communities. And that's what we're doing. We initiated a program within the European Violence Prevention Network called the European Praxis Exchange. 14 European states are now involved. That program is being run. The key to that program is to get practitioners to understand how to deliver Prevent programs within their communities,
but why
rather than using...
But why exceptionalize this as being something... You see, the starting point is that we don't trust these communities. That's my point.
Well, I think
we have 3 million Muslims.
We've got about
The
a minute
decision
left to
should
go.
come-
So let's Madeline, let me hear from you.
I've just said that the decision should come from the communities, and they should be allowed to have a comment on these policies and the effects. There needs to be a better understanding of the effects of these policies on local communities. So there should be a lot more attention paid to these communities and people who are doing great work within them, and for them to be able to bridge between the communities and policymakers, rather than always having to be responding to state definitions. And this is really the problem, and why Prevent has not been taken up well.
Okay, listen,
within
thank you
these
very much
communities, and
indeed.
has
Thank
been
you for your
discussed.
time. I hope we've cleared up some misunderstandings, even though perhaps I am a bigot. I was only asking a question out of what I thought was the general public interest. Thank you very much indeed for coming, David Otto, also, and thank you for watching. This has been Roundtable. I'm David Foster. I hope to have your company next time. Goodbye.